Welcome to Beyond Bridge, the podcast where courage meets community. We shine a light on the stories, science, and support that define the breast cancer journey. From survivors and thrivers to doctors and advocates, we're here to share real conversations, expert insights, and the hope that carries us forward. Whether you're newly diagnosed, a lifelong fighter, or walking alongside someone you love, this is your space, your voice, and your story. Welcome to the Bridge Community Podcast, a podcast focused on breast cancer and African American women's health, where we bring powerful stories, expert insights, and the latest in health and wellness. I'm your host, Jacqueline Anthony, and we're diving into a topic that affects millions around the world, breast cancer. Whether you're a survivor, a loved one, a caregiver, or someone seeking to understand more, this podcast is for you. Explore the journey of diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. Hear from leading experts and courageous individuals who faced breast cancer head-on and highlight the importance of early detection and support. Our conversation today is with Dr. Lauren McCullough, Associate Professor of Epidemiology at Emory University. She is a graduate of Vanderbilt University, Meharry Medical College, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research interests are in cancer epidemiology and prevention, health disparities, and social determinants of health. Her research goals are to improve cancer outcomes in underserved populations, and she is the creator of the Bridge community. Lauren, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Jacqueline.
Okay, so let's get right into our conversation. So let's get a lesson in Cancer 101. I need for you to explain some terms. I just said a big word called epidemiology. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that, and then let's talk about social determinants of health. So epidemiology, what is that?
So epidemiology is not studying the skin, as some people would suspect. It is really understanding the distribution and determinants of disease. So the root word is epidemic. And so how disease is formed, how it is then sort of segmented across the population, who gets it, who does not, what are the factors that increase risk, decrease risk. And so we think of ourselves as epidemiologists as sort of the science of public health in dealing with disease and distributions, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people at a time. And so that's the work that we do as epidemiologists. And our work can be very different depending on your disease interest. Mine is of cancer. And so thinking about why people get cancer, what are the risk factors? What are the preventative factors? Why are certain groups more or less at risk is really what I'm interested in. And then once they get cancer, who survives and who does not, and why is that? And how can we prevent that or improve those outcomes?
Now, we've heard about the social determinants of health. Explain that a little bit more.
Right. So social determinants of health is a concept that has been around for a couple of decades, and it really is thinking about where a person lives, their environment, where they engage, and how that influences their health outcomes. And so when we think about social determinants of health, we're thinking about things like healthcare access, education, housing, social factors, and how all of those factors together then impact a person's health behaviors, how it impacts their exposures to certain things that may drive disease. And then, of course, how they are able to get the care that they need, either to prevent disease or to treat disease. So social determinants of health is really important as an epidemiologist in thinking about sort of what are the factors that are potentially preventable, either through policy or through individual behavior, that drive health outcomes.
Okay, and our last word that we need to have defined, health disparities. I guess that's two words. health disparities.
Right. So health disparity is also one that is often ill-defined. A lot of people think about sort of differences between two groups. Women are more likely to get breast cancer than men. Yes, men do get breast cancer. That is a health difference, right? It is a difference that emerges because of biology. When we think about health disparities, we're thinking about more than a difference. We're thinking about differences that arise due to some underlying inequity. So that Black women are more likely to get aggressive breast cancer is a health disparity and not just a health difference. So I think the sort of fundamental concept here is that they arise because of some type of inequity.
Okay. So all of those terms, epidemiology, social determinants of health, health disparities, all of that and all of your research led to the creation of the Bridge community. Okay? So share with us, what is the Bridge community? What's the forum? What are those things that go into making it? Who are the women that are involved? And the reason why I'm asking that, because we call our podcast the Bridge community. All right. So tell us how you came to create the Bridge community.
Absolutely. So I'm going to back it up a little bit and start with our Bridge research program, which involves me and other investigators, and we are, of course, interested in understanding breast and other sort of female cancers and why Black women disproportionately die of these cancers. And so our research program is really focused on understanding these disparities. One of the things that I think you quickly realize as a scientist, particularly an epidemiologist and working in public health, is that even though you are charged with the public's health, oftentimes the research can become very segmented from the people that it serves. We look at thousands and thousands of data points. We track tens of thousands of individuals over time, yet you can spend your entire career as an epidemiologist and not come in contact with a single person that has a disease of interest. And something about that doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right to study outside of the context of the people who you were studying. And so one of the reasons that I was compelled to develop the Bridge Community Program is because I did not like the disjointedness in how we conduct science and how we conduct research. Research should be conducted in partnership with the communities that the research should serve. It should also be conducted in partnership with other researchers who are not epidemiologists, who, do basic science, who are clinicians, who are statisticians. And so we call our program, both programs, Bridge, and that's because we want there to be connection. The research can't be disconnected from the people. And so Bridge Community was really born to create those connections, to create that shared sense of ownership. And so the goals really are, one, to provide a place for women to come and share their experiences, and for us as researchers just to listen, just to understand those experiences. And oftentimes I've learned in being a part of this program that it gives us new insights to our data. Things that we're perplexed by, it takes a survivor looking at it and say, oh, this is what's going on, right? But because we don't live and breathe that experience, we don't have that vantage point. So that's sort of the first goal, for women to be able to come in and have a place where they can share their experiences, and we can receive those stories and apply them to our research. But also just finding a place where there is connectedness, again, that bridge where they don't feel alone, where there are other women that have experienced the same thing, but may have a different story or a different path. And I think we find connectedness in our stories. I believe 100% you can't hear a person's personal story and turn away from them. And so by having community, we feel like we're better able to serve the women who have breast cancer by creating these spaces and places. And so that is sort of the most intimate part of Bridge Community. But the other things we do, consistent with what I told you about the name and the overarching goal, is to create a larger and more robust community around breast cancer and breast cancer survivorship. And so we engage in things like the community forum that's held every October to bring not just the women, not just the researchers, but policymakers, caregivers, our clinicians, to bring everyone into one setting with equal footing to address this problem of breast cancer disparities in our communities. And so it really is just about bringing people together, breaking down silos, and coalescing around a central problem that, in my opinion, is hugely affecting our community of Black women.
So women of color, Black women in particular, are hit the hardest when it comes to breast cancer, in terms of diagnosis, in terms of treatment, in terms of survivorship, in terms of death. And we're more likely to be diagnosed at later stages and face higher mortality rates. So what causes these disparities? Do we have an answer to that, or are we still investigating that? So what causes the disparities?
The short answer is we're still investigating. And in different parts of the cancer continuum. So when I say cancer continuum, I'm talking about from when that cancer is initiated all the way through diagnosis and treatment and survivorship. That is kind of the continuum that we think of. We have insights. I think research has really shown us a lot over the last several decades. But to say we know what causes it, I think is really a complex and sort of loaded question. Obviously, we know what some of the risk factors are for breast cancer, things like reproductive characteristics and lack of physical activity and obesity and all of those things. But when we think about why Black women get the more aggressive types of breast cancer, there's been a lot of research in just underlying genetics, but that doesn't really tell us the whole story. And so that is the piece that I think that as a community of scientists that we are still trying to understand what's driving these more aggressive types beyond just the genetic risk. And when we think about, the outcomes and what's driving, differences in survivorship, that question is even more complex, because not only do you have to consider the biology or the individual person's risk, but now you have to think about what are all sort of the other intersections, like healthcare and biases by providers and not responding to treatment and adherence to therapy. The picture and the puzzle becomes even more complex. So it is something that we are unraveling. I think we're in an age where our technologies are better. Some of our ability to disentangle things are better. And so I am excited about the opportunities that will present to try and get at these questions. So we're making strides, but we are not there yet.
Okay. I know when I participate with Bridge Community, and there are a lot of women who come to the forum, and then we have our cohort groups, have women from different backgrounds and so forth. And when we're talking about the disparities, what is the relationship between, if there is one, between socioeconomic status, education, and access to health care that influence outcomes? We were hopeful that Black women of a certain socioeconomic status will have readily available access to her for the standard of care treatment or beyond. So how does all that play out, if it does?
Right, yeah. So I'll start with sort of the general premise and thought is that for any woman, not just a Black woman, or anybody, not just women, men as well, if you are better positioned to have quality health care, then you should have quality outcomes, right? Like that's the fundamental premise that is there. And I think globally that is true. One of the challenges in research is oftentimes researchers haven't had the numbers of Black women in research studies to dig into that fundamental premise more deeply. And so in Bridge, when we have been, had the opportunity to really dig in, some of the things that we find are a little bit perplexing. And, one of the trends, which we're actually writing a paper on right now, is that for white women, as their socioeconomic status decreases, or increases, they have better health outcomes. So it's this nice sort of linear, if you can imagine a line, as one goes up, the other goes up, right? But for Black women, the trend is not that straightforward. And so what we see is as socioeconomics increases, and so presumably that means having insurance, that means having transportation, going to better facilities, we see a increase in trend in health, and then at a point it just flattens. And at the highest point of SES, sometimes it drops off. And so if you can imagine sort of what that looks like, it sort of looks almost like, the top of a trapezoid, right? And so this is a phenomenon that our group really began to dig into and try and understand, like, is this just happening in Georgia? Is this just happening with breast cancer? And we just finished this big analysis, which we're trying to publish, that says, nope, this is not just a Georgia thing. We see it across the U.S., and this is not just a breast cancer thing. We actually see it in most of the female cancers, including uterine and ovarian. And so we're calling this a diminishing return. And so there's sort of two concepts. There's that differential access. So if you don't have access to transportation, insurance, et cetera, you're going to have poor outcomes. That is true. That is across the board. Doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter your sex. But the diminishing returns is something that I think is unique to minoritized populations, Black women in particular, where there is not a linear gain in health. Right. And trying to figure out why that is something that I think is new and interesting and important to understand, because as we think about interventions, it's not just, oh, Black women, make sure you get a good job, make sure you have insurance, and when this happens to you, you're going to be okay. Our data show that is not necessarily the case. So what else is happening and what else is going on? And that's something that, we have conversations with the Bridge community about. And in those conversations really have been informative in thinking about what the next steps are.
So when we think about the outcomes for Black women, what would you consider to be the trauma? And I didn't ask that question correctly. So let me back up a minute. We African American women come from a culture of trauma. Mm-hmm. How do you think, how has that impacted our response to treatment, and how does that impact our outcomes? The trauma that we have faced culturally, right, as a group of women.
Right. I think that's a great question. And the first thing that I think about as a scientist is what I'm going to call epigenetics, and I'll break that word down a little bit. Okay. So I study the epigenome, and if you think about, everybody knows what genes are, right? Like I think we can start there. That fundamental premise. In your genome are all your genes in your body. I like to think about the genome as being like when you get a new computer and you open it, you got Windows 10 or whatever it is, right? And you're kind of stuck with that. Your epigenome is the layer on top of your genome that changes how your genes are read and expressed. So if you go back to that computer, it is the software that you put on your computer. Okay. You can add it, you can update it, you can remove it, you can change it over time. But that underlying Windows 10, you're kind of stuck with that. And so as a public health scientist, I've been really interested in the epigenome because I can't do nothing about your genes. But if we know that eating a high fruit and vegetable diet can alter your epigenome, which leads to better outcomes, then that is an intervention that we can do. And so with that sort of basic understanding, we know that the stress that has persisted in the Black community for decades, for centuries, has altered their epigenetics. And those epigenetics have been passed down generation to generation. And so they are encoded in the DNA of Black women. And so what happens is, from a biologic perspective, especially in cancer, if you don't have that uniquely traumatized DNA as you're developing your drugs, you don't know the effects, right? And so the fact that Black individuals haven't been in clinical trials with our DNA, with all that comes with being who we are, is one reason perhaps that Black women aren't responding to treatment, regardless of their socioeconomic status. We also know that those changes in our DNA, the changes in our stress factors, impacts cancer progression. It impacts how aggressive it is. It impacts how it responds to different treatments and therapies. And so I certainly think that the trauma, the shared trauma among this group of women is something that has manifested over time and certainly has impact on cancer outcomes. And so, a very simplified perspective is it's just, Black women are just more likely to have aggressive disease. Like, that's overly simplistic. It is not our ancestry 100%. It is not our genes 100%, but it is the combination of our shared historical experience, which does impact our biology.
That's heavy. That's heavy. So we're talking a little bit about the trauma that we share culturally. So if I'm hearing you correctly, even if an African-American woman is at the height of her career, she's got access to everything, transportation, money, great education, great family life, great support system. Are you telling us that she still may have a negative outcome if she happens to get breast cancer and not survive and not thrive? Is her outcome still going to be worse than a white woman that's got all those things that are equal?
So on an individual level, she is going to have a better outcome than a person that does not have it, right? Our interest is always in health equity. And so compared to her white counterpart, it is more likely that she would have a poorer outcome, right? And it's not always because of what's embedded in the genes or, the epigenome. A lot of times it is because of the trauma that comes with rising to a certain economic status and what kind of comes along with that. We know, and there's good data to suggest, that Black women that live in higher socioeconomic neighborhoods experience more racism, more discrimination, more negative interactions with police. And it is because they are occupying spaces that were not designed for them. And so a lot of what we're really interested in is, how are women coping? Because you and I can experience the same thing and internalize it very differently.
That is correct.
Right? And so that's a big part of all of this that we don't have good data on. What are the buffering factors individually that people use to buffer against those insults that may make them have better outcomes? There are people that internalize every insult, right? And that has a physiologic effect on the body, and that drives cancer. And so some of those nuances we don't know. We're only beginning to scratch the surface. But it is absolutely possible for anyone, Black woman, white woman, or otherwise, to have all available resources and still not have a positive outcome. I think the question is, why disproportionately is it Black women?
Black women, right?
Yeah.
Right. That's right. Okay, so let's talk about medical bias. All right. What are some examples that you can share of implicit bias in the healthcare system that may affect breast cancer diagnosis or treatment? I know when I was going through my cancer, I was very young, and so there were certain things that I didn't know to ask because I was a kid almost, right? And so I don't think that I was in some instance discriminated against because I was African American, but I do know that there are some women who feel that, and how does that affect the diagnosis in the treatment.
Mm-hmm.
We treat it differently. We're not getting the right information, or not necessarily the right information, but the right information that's culturally correct for us.
Right.
So how does that play into that?
Right. I think there are a lot of ways that implicit biases can emerge in medical care. And this is non-specific to breast cancer. So in your example, even just being young
Mm-hmm.
can prevent a woman from getting an appropriate workup and diagnosis of breast cancer, because everything about the data says median age is 61. So if you come in and you're 25, they're not thinking breast cancer. And oftentimes they're not listening to the patient, right? So there could be other things that are also barriers to having optimal outcomes. But, some of the biases, and again, documented in the medical literature, are around Black women's pain, Black women's side effects, and providers just not understanding that when a woman says, I'm in pain, or I feel a lump, or I feel like something is going on that maybe I can't even articulate, that something is going on. And that implicit bias of this person not having the credibility because I don't align with them either by sex or by race, can determine how that patient is then worked up and followed. And those are some of the more mundane examples. There are other examples that I think are more extreme, but probably most interactions are things that, as you say, are just implicit biases and not anything that is overt. But we certainly know that Black women's pain is very much ignored, that the expectation that the pain tolerance is higher. There's also sort of the opposite, that Black women are treated more aggressively because of the fact that, the statistics are what they are. And so a woman may be told to be on a regimen of chemotherapy that may not be necessary for her cancer. And we see that with race, we see that with obesity, we see that with a number of different characteristics. And so it really can go both ways. It could be under treatment because of factors, it can be over treatment because of factors. But I think it boils down to cultural competency and understanding, and respect of persons, the person that's on the table or across from you. And I think as a medical community, we can do better.
So cultural competency, would you advocate for an African-American woman or any other culturally diverse individual to be seen, to have medical professionals that look like them rather than not, to help with some of that cultural relevance piece in terms of healthcare and outcomes?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to break this up by population data versus individual. I think from a population perspective, we have seen generally that women who are treated with by providers who are race concordant and sex concordant have better outcomes, right? That's on a population level. On an individual level, my recommendation is always go with the person that makes you feel comfortable, right? Where you feel like you can come and be your authentic self, and that person sees you and hears you and validates your feelings and works with you to develop a treatment plan that you feel comfortable with. That is the person you go with. Doesn't matter if they're red, purple, green, or blue, right? And so I think, that says, it speaks to sort of both things. I think people that are not race concordant or sex concordant can treat you and you can have optimal health outcomes. But generally we do see that, it's better when we have providers who understand. It's better when we have researchers who are a part of the demographic, because then you do start to account for these differences, and so you see better outcomes on a population level.
Let's talk a little bit about empowerment and advocacy. Women must be their own advocate, or they can be their best advocate. What can individuals do to advocate for themselves or their loved ones when facing barriers to care? What does that look like? What can they do in those situations?
I think the first thing is have someone with you. I've talked to so many women who, cancer is a big deal. It's a big diagnosis. And oftentimes you are in it and you need to have someone that is not so in it that can listen and can ask questions, who will sit down with you before the appointment to make sure you've outlined your questions so that during the appointment, if you were in another headspace, they can be sure to get your questions answered. So I say the first thing is just have someone with you, partner, friend, whatever. I think that's really important. I think it's important to really know what you want in the process. Your treatment regimen should always be explained to you, and everyone has their preferences about what it is they want and they don't want. Communicate those to your provider. They could be absolutely not the right thing to do, but it's your provider's job to explain to you the risks, the benefits, and to help you make an informed decision for you. Right? It is your decision. And I think starting by thinking through what is it that I want for myself is an important sort of foundational piece that every person needs to have. And I think when you start with that piece, you go in with just a little bit more authority than being a bystander and allowing someone else to tell you what should be done. Right? Even if at the end of the day, the whole plan changes, at least you went in standing firm on this is what I want for myself. And I think the third thing, and I will say I am 100% guilty of this, use your privilege. Use the privilege that you have. I cannot tell you the number of times I have gotten calls from my white friends, white neighbors, white people that are just in the same ballpark that I am with my kids that said, oh, you work at Emory. I need to get my friend's aunt's sister in. Can you call such and such? Like 3 degrees of like separation.
Okay.
And then there are times that I will have my paternal aunt diagnosed and I won't even know it. And there is something about our community that still carries some sort of shame or some sort of keep it on the hush thing that they do not do. They are like screaming at the rooftops. This is going on with me. I need help. And the squeaky wheel gets the oil. My husband is often upset with me because I'll go into a medical care system and never tell people what I do. And he's like, I don't understand this. Mm-hmm. So I am also guilty of it, but I think we need to stop that. We need to use what little sort of connections, what little privilege we have to ensure that we have the best potential outcome.
I second that. I do. Use the privilege that you have. And I also understand and hear when you say that we as a community don't share what's going on with us, with each other. Very rarely do African Americans in their own family know their medical history.
Yep.
We have to pull that out of when Uncle Johnny dies. Well, why did Uncle Johnny die?
Yep.
And Uncle Johnny died because he had diabetes. Well, nobody said he had that, and then he's gone. And now we're trying to figure out, is diabetes in our family?
Right.
And we need to be having those conversations before there's a death so that we can prevent and have better outcomes in our own lives while we're still living. So I second you on that one. So what gives you hope when it comes to closing this gap in breast cancer outcomes? What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is sort of the changing landscape of the science. When I began my training, and I was very close to the disparities research that was going on in breast cancer, and that was really when we learned a lot about triple negative breast cancer. Racism, discrimination, structural inequities were not a part of the vernacular. That in my training, and I'm not that old, like in my training, that was not a part of the narrative. And so that my master students who were, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and 22 years old are thinking about and oftentimes not Black, are asking questions about how discrimination and how structural factors impact health outcomes, that gives me hope because they are training with that perspective, right? And so the future gives me hope. It gives me hope that I can go into a research group meeting that, I try and make it majority Black, but it's still majority white. And I can come as my full authentic self and talk about some of the issues that are in our society and how that impacts cancer outcomes. And it is not awkward, right? That we can have some of these conversations. And, obviously we're in a time right now where there's a lot of pushback back on that. But if you look over the history of our people, there has always been pushback to progress. And so this is a momentary setback. But when I see the next generation of people that are going to be those providers, that are going to be those researchers, they have been trained in an environment where it is just as important that person's social determinants of health as it is their genes, right? And so that is the piece that gives me hope. And again, just the technological advancements that we're making, it really is going to help in really understanding what's happening and being able to sort of disentangle all the different things that we know are involved in cancer.
I know one of the things that gives me hope is that I am beginning to see that there are more support groups for women of color than when I had my first diagnosis when I was in my 20s. I went to a breast cancer support group and everybody was older than me and they were all dying. And I said, I can't be a part of this, because I was not dying. I was trying to figure out how to live through this and to move on with my life. And so I am hopeful because I see so many other women who are creating their own nonprofits. You see doctors doing more in terms of the support piece, and you see women coming together and having conversations around what's going on in their bodies. And so that gives me hope when I see that, because many years ago when I was diagnosed, there was nothing for me, at least in my mind. And now I see so much more for women that they are truly not alone in this. Although the journey for them may be the same, may be different, they can operate in a space that is more holistic than when I had my cancer. And that gives me hope.
Right.
All right. So, Dr. McCullough, I appreciate our conversation and your expertise. We've uncovered some hard truths about breast cancer's disparities and how systemic equities, barriers to care. And I just want to thank you for stopping by and giving us your insights and your expertise in this field. You are truly on the cutting edge of everything, and that's why I love you so much.
And I love you back.
Okay, so I am Jacqueline Anthony for Dr. Lauren McCullough and our podcast team. I want to thank you for listening. Beyond Bridge, a place of strength, support, and shared stories. If the conversation touched your heart, be sure to share it with someone walking this journey. And always remember, you are not alone. God walks with you, even in the valleys. Lean on His promises, trust His timing, and never lose hope. Until next time, may you be covered in grace, filled with courage, and surrounded by love. I am Jacqueline Anthony. For all of us at Bridge, thanks for joining the conversation.